Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2013 Senior Core Virtual Conference. A few other housekeeping items for this session. We will not have a live chat or question answer feature today. However, we encourage you to send any questions you may have directly to the Office of Inspector General at questions@cncsoig.gov. It is my pleasure to introduce the Corporation for National and Community Service Inspector General, Ms. Deborah Jeffrey. Ms. Jeffrey joined the Corporation for National and Community Service as Inspector General on July 19, 2012, shortly after her confirmation by the U.S. Senate. In her 25 years in the private practice of law, Ms. Jeffrey represented organizations and individuals in civil and criminal litigation, defended senior government officials in high-profile criminal, Inspector General, and congressional investigations, conducted sensitive investigations for publicly traded companies, major NGOs, and law firms, advised lawyers and law firms on matters of professional ethics and risk management, and assisted organizations in developing internal controls. Ms. Jeffrey was with us at the inaugural virtual conference last year, and we were thrilled when she enthusiastically accepted the invitation to join us again. So without further delay, I introduce Ms. Deborah Jeffrey, the Office of Inspector General for the Corporation for National and Community Service.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. In fact, it's a rare pleasure because those of us in the Office of Inspector General tend to spend most of our time with people who are having difficulties, often serious difficulties. So we really enjoy the opportunity to speak to the folks out there in the field who are doing everything they can to get it right so they won't have to come to our attention in the course of our duties throughout the year. The purpose of today's conference is to acquaint you generally with what the Office of Inspector General does, to give you some tips about how you can learn to prevent, detect, and remedy the most common problems that we see, and to know how and when to contact the Office of Inspector General. Our mission, in short, is to make the corporation operate better. The charge of any Office of Inspector General, and there are 73 of them throughout the federal government, is to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of agency programs and operations and prevent and detect waste, fraud, and abuse. And we do that in three basic ways. First, we conduct audits and investigations. Second, we can recommend policies that will prevent problems. And third, we keep the corporation's CEO and the Congress informed about our findings. A few key facts about the Office of Inspector General. First of all, statutorily, we are independent of the corporation. We report directly to the Congress and we report administratively to the CEO. We have a separate appropriation, so we're insulated from financial concerns. And most important, all of our personnel have to be objective and impartial in conducting our work. So the idea is that we stand within the corporation, but a little bit outside it. We're knowledgeable about the program's operations, but we can give a kind of clear-headed and independent perspective. Okay, what does OIG not do? Well, the one thing we don't do is by law, we cannot manage or direct agency programs or operations. And that means that questions about programs or operational issues should be directed to the corporation or to your local state office, not to the OIG. But here's what we do. In a word, it's oversight. We provide independent and constructive criticism to improve the way the corporation and its programs operate. And we do it through two basic activities, audits and investigations. An investigation, is anybody who watches TV and is familiar with police dramas knows, is an inquiry conducted in response to an allegation or evidence of misconduct. And typically, the types of investigations we conduct deal with things like fraud, theft, or misuse of funds. An audit, by contrast, is a general review to be sure that a grantee is properly handling and accounting for federal funds and complying with other program requirements. The purpose of an audit is to identify and recommend correction of any deficiencies so that the organization will be stronger. As you all know, grants come with strings, and those are based on the terms and conditions of the grant, federal law, and regulations. And of course, grantees are accountable not only for complying with those requirements, but maintaining records to show that they've complied. And the lesson there is make sure you are thoroughly familiar with the terms and conditions and the applicable rules and regulations enforced during your grant. Don't just put the grant documents in a drawer and forget about what they say. It's particularly important in the current fiscal environment because there is a real focus on accountability when resources are scarce. Our basic theme today is that if you have sound systems and practices in your organization, that will promote integrity and accountability. The best way to do that is to have systems and policies in procedures in place at the beginning of the grant to make sure that your organization operates within the rules of your federal assistance and compile and retain full documentation. Basically, if you have the procedures and everyone gets accustomed to following them, that will prevent you from finding yourselves in trouble and spending more time with my office. So what is it that are the basic building blocks of accountability? Well, the first item is strong internal controls. What are internal controls? They are systems of checks and balances that protect an organization against fraud and mistakes. And they can be simple things like requiring 2 signatures for expenditures above a certain amount, monitoring the charge card purchases to be sure that they're all proper under the grant, reconciling bank accounts, and inventorying property. Those are all examples of internal controls. Another important ingredient is to have up-to-date rules and procedures, and not just have them on paper, but then follow them. An absolute key is the third item that you see on this PowerPoint, active financial management and review. And to some of you, this might seem a little intimidating. I'm guessing that most of you are not accountants or auditors, and that seems like it may be too technical. And in any event, your principal focus is on actually administering the programs. But I'm here to tell you, not only is it important, it is certainly within your capability. You do not need to be an auditor or an accountant to understand these things. You need to understand your organization's finances and to review them frequently. That's the way you will have a sense if something is out of whack, and you can get involved early to make sure that it gets fixed. The next item is your organization must not only follow the rules, it has to have the records to show that it's followed the rules. And so it's particularly important to have accurate and contemporaneous records. That is, the records shouldn't be prepared after the fact. They should be prepared at the time of the activity that you're documenting. All right, we all know that it's important to follow the federal laws, rules, regulations, and grant terms. And I want to spend a little time on the final item, the tone at the top. That is absolutely critical. Your employees and your volunteers take their cue from the organization's leadership about what's important and what attitude they should have about following rules. If you communicate that these rules are a nuisance, they will regard them as a nuisance. They'll take them as something that's inconvenient to do and an afterthought and of secondary importance. That's a really bad idea. Instead, you will have a much better outcome and much better compliance if you present accountability as a core value of your organization and integral to everything you do. It is part of the fabric of the way your organization does business. And if that's your philosophy and you not only talk that language, but you live it, your people see that you follow the rules, you are careful about contemporaneous record keeping, you are careful about procedures, they will absorb that attitude from you, and that will promote overall accountability and strengthen your organization. I want to talk a little bit about the accountability problems that we see. These are problems that we see frequently when we audit grantees. They can lead to serious consequences, including disallowance of costs or requirements that a grantee repay grant funds. And when we see problems across the board in a number of these categories, that can sometimes lead the corporation to say, this is a grantee that is not interested in following the rules, that is reckless, and therefore that's a grantee the corporation doesn't want to do business with. And we've compiled this list and the slides that follow based on what it is we in the Office of Inspector General often see when we go out and we audit a grantee. The first item is if you have multiple grants, you have to account separately for each of them. Different grants involve different activities and expenses, so make sure you keep separate track of which expenses pertain to each grant. You would be surprised how often we get out in the field and we find that money has been sort of moved around or spent indiscriminately, and that is a huge problem. The second thing is you all have to submit federal financial reports, your FFRs. They need to be submitted for senior corps twice a year. Make sure you submit them on schedule. And the next item shouldn't be every quarter, it should be twice a year. Whenever you submit your FFRs, make sure they reconcile to your organization's internal accounting records. You would be surprised how often we find that a grantee's internal records show that its expenses were lower than the expenses it's reported to the federal government. That is a serious problem. So make sure your accounting staff can show you the reconciliation every time you submit an FFR, and that they can explain any differences. And there often are small differences based on timing, so don't let that worry you. But be sure that there is a clear, coherent explanation of those differences, and don't let them leave your office until you understand. If it doesn't make sense to you, chances are it doesn't make sense, and there is something wrong and you need to get to the bottom of it. As you all know, a grantee should draw only enough in federal funds from a grant to meet current expenses. So be sure that you are not holding on to a reservoir of federal funds. Grant funds are not a loan. They aren't to fund your expenses outside of those allowable under the grant. Doing that would be considered a misuse of federal funds, and that can be a serious problem. So you want to be sure you are drawing on funds to pay your immediate expenses, and you are not holding federal funds sitting in an account. Again, more of our problems. We sometimes find, I would say frequently find, when we do an audit, that staff and volunteer timesheets are not completed correctly. They are done long after the fact. And in some cases, they've been signed by a supervisor before they're completed. Okay, well, since the supervisor's signature amounts to a certification that that supervisor has personal knowledge that these individuals have performed the work on their timesheets, obviously they can't be signed in advance. So make sure that they are submitted properly, they are approved properly, and they are done regularly on schedule and in a timely fashion. The timesheets, of course, have to reflect the actual work that's done. Occasionally, we'll find a grantee that sort of submitted timesheets based on budgeted amounts. That's fiction, and that is a serious problem. Again, these are things that can result in disallowance of significant costs. You don't want to have that happen. The timesheets are considered evidence that the activities were permissible under the grant and were actually performed. So that's why it's very important to keep these records in an organized fashion to make sure they are properly signed to show that the work actually took place. If the timesheets are not properly completed, then the hours and the associated costs must be disallowed. So this is, the good news here is that this is an avoidable problem. If you are careful about it, you will never face this problem. So what can you do to know whether your organization is doing the right thing about timesheets? Well, for one thing, you can decide that you are occasionally, maybe once a quarter, going to conduct your own timesheet audit. You can look at the timesheets for 1 or 2 pay periods to be sure that they are complete in all respects. And my first bit of advice to you about that would be to say you should do this early in the grant cycle so that you can identify and correct any problems before they snowball into large amounts. Follow up to make sure that any corrections have been made, and sometimes that may indicate to you that you need additional training for staff or some reminders. If there is a need to change a timesheet because something was done incorrectly, make sure you show the change clearly, initial it and date it by the individual and the supervisor, and note the reason. So it's clear that this is not an effort to falsify anything. You discovered an error. Here's what the error was. Everyone acknowledges they had a day wrong or something like that, and so they've now fixed it. Be on the lookout for timesheet fraud. When you have multiple timesheets that look like they were prepared at the same time, occasionally we'll find pre-printed hours, and they're submitted and or signed by the supervisor before the end of the period covered. That tells you you have a problem. You need to get that untangled quickly. And here's a sanity check. If you have staff that work on multiple grants and charge their time to multiple grants, look at all of their timesheets for a period and make sure the hours don't add up to more than 100%. And that's just a kind of what I would consider a sanity check. Another problem we see very frequently is that organizations do not properly and timely complete the checks of the National Sex Offender Public Registry, now the public website, and the criminal history checks. Right? Congress mandated those checks to ensure that neither the public nor volunteers are harmed in the course of national service. And of course, we all want to think that the people we know and the people we work with couldn't possibly have any problematic history. But regrettably, that's not the case. One of the things we know about sex offenders is that they move around the country, and sometimes they even change names to avoid detection and to gain access to vulnerable populations. So it's really critical that you do this and that you do it at the beginning. Note that for the criminal histories and the sex offender registry checks, there are specific legal requirements to maintain original documentation of the results of these searches. So it's not enough to do it and check the box that you did it. You have to keep a copy of the results. Another concern along these lines is for FGP and SCP, both of them have income eligibility thresholds if your volunteers are to get stipend checks. So you have to document that you have checked those things, okay, and you have records showing that you have checked those things. Those are threshold eligibility issues, okay? If the checks are not performed and documented with the original records, then grant funds can't be used to pay for staff and volunteers, and the expenses have to be disallowed. So if you check this carefully up front, again, you won't find yourself with this problem late in the day. Here, just like with the timesheets, you can conduct your own review, and because these are threshold issues, we strongly recommend that you undertake that review early in the grant life cycle. That gives you a chance to go back and correct it if you've got a problem before you've lost a lot of time and you've lost a lot of money. Many grantees can get confused about match dollars, all right? Funds that are treated as match funds are subject to the same limitations that the grant funds are subject to. If a cost is not allowable in the grant, it's not allowable with the funds you want to count as match funds. So make sure that those match dollars are recorded in the general ledger and make sure that they are documented to the same extent as they would be for grant funds. Make sure you know what the source of match contributions are. There are some sources that are prohibited. You want it to be clear that you know where the money came from and it's from an okay source. Often we will see grantees count in-kind match contributions towards their match requirement. And there, it's critical that you substantiate the market value of those in-kind match contributions. One example is, let's say, foster grandparents who are volunteering in schools, and they may receive a school lunch on the days that they're in their volunteering, and you would like to count that school lunch towards the value of your match. Well, so what do you need to do in order to be able to do that? Well, number one, you need a record that individual volunteer, Mr. Smith, actually received a school lunch on date X when he volunteered. So one way to do that is to keep track of that on people's timesheets. They can indicate, did they get a lunch? Did they, for example, travel expenses? Did they incur travel expenses? And if so, how much? So the first thing is, did they actually get the benefit of an in-kind match? The next thing is, what's the value of that in-kind match? And here again, we've seen grantees rely on estimates and guesses and kind of good faith, let me take a stab at it numbers, instead of really getting the market value. If you're dealing with school lunches, the school district must have guidelines about what it spends on average on these meals. So make sure you have a copy of that information, not just a phone call, but that you've got a document that says school lunch meals average $5.35 a piece. And that way you know that you've got a basis for charging them, charging your match at that rate. The match contributions are a key part of CNCS grants, so you need to document them just to the same extent as the other grant expenses. And you have to do it correctly because the match contributions, in turn, entitle your organization to the corresponding federal funds. So if you mess up in the documentation of your match contributions, that affects not only the match, it really disqualifies you from the corresponding federal funds. And again, you don't want to be in that position. If you're careful up front, you won't be. We talked a little bit about reimbursable meals and travel, okay? Like other expenses, those need to be documented. It is often convenient to do that on timesheets, and it allows your senior core program officers or grant officers, when they come out to do a monitoring visit, it's much easier to trace all of these things if they're documented on the same timesheets, same document as you have the timesheets. Again, here, make sure that those reimbursable meals and travel are shown at actual amounts, not estimated, not budgeted. You really want to know how much did this person incur or receive. We have a long list of problems that we see when we do these audits, so I've got a number of these for you. The next thing is, remember I told you not to put the grant documents in a drawer and forget about them? Know what expenses, including which personnel, the grant does and does not cover. And look at your expenses periodically to be sure that only allowable expenses are being charged to the grant. Grant funds and match funds can't be used to fund your other organizational activities, even for the short term. Borrowing money from your grant funds to pay other expenses is a serious, indeed potentially criminal violation. So make sure you know exactly what needs to be covered so you never have to answer those questions. Next, confirm that you have the receipts for those expenses. So there's evidence that you actually incurred the expenses, and make sure your employees provide you with those receipts. It's not just somebody's word. There's a document that said, we bought this equipment and it was covered by the grant. We bought these supplies, they were covered by the grant. We traveled to thus and such a conference, those conference expenses were covered by the grant. The last issue concerns drawdowns. Do your drawdowns match your expenditures? As you know, under federal rules, you should only draw enough to meet your current expenses. You shouldn't be holding large sums of federal funds or drawing in advance. Okay, so we look often at those. Is there a correspondence between the amount that you've drawn and the amount that you've spent? We know, for example, that there is likely to be a problem if all or most of the grants have been drawn down well before the end of the grant year. There are some exceptions to that, but not many. Or if you've got a lot of money left in the grant at the end of the year, and all of a sudden we see a flurry of expenditures at the end of the grant to use up the unused funds. That's often a suggestion that those expenses are not related to this grant, but that somehow an organization is trying to use that money to prepare itself for subsequent years, and that is a serious problem. I don't know how many of you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, okay, but if you do, know what expenses it includes and check to be sure you're not charging the grant directly for expenses that are covered by the indirect cost rate. That's effectively double charging the grant. We've seen some instances of that. They ended up being substantial amounts of money. And here's the most basic point. Maintain records of who your current volunteers are, what they're doing, where they're serving, and who their supervisors are. You would be surprised at the number of times we go on an audit to a grantee and we talk to volunteers, and sometimes they don't know who's responsible for supervising them. They know who signs their timesheets, but that's somebody they don't really know very well. It's someone they don't have a lot of contact with from time to time. So you want to be sure that it's very clear to your grantees what's going on and who's in charge, and that you can produce a list of your volunteers and their duty stations. Now, for FGP and SCP, your payroll records will capture a lot of this information. It's a little more challenging for RSVP because the nature of the service is that people may kind of drop in and drop out. They may be out for ill health. They may be traveling. There are a number of reasons that they may not maintain a very consistent schedule, or someone who is active may become inactive. But do your utmost to maintain a current list of your volunteers and exactly what their assignments are. Some of you will have the misfortune to confront dishonest conduct inside your organization. Some people are just fundamentally dishonest and untrustworthy. Other times, good people act under financial pressure, or in the heat of the moment, they do the expedient thing instead of the right thing. And sometimes people can act to cover up a mistake and thereby worsen the problem. Any dishonesty that relates to a federally funded activity is by definition serious and is very likely potentially criminal. Okay, it's almost certainly fraud. So here are some of the kinds of fraud that we've seen in corporation programs. We see misuse of grant funds for non-grant purposes, even temporarily. I mentioned that's a serious concern. We see funds drawn down on unoccupied volunteer slots. Again, that's taking in money that the organization is not entitled to. We talked a little bit about timesheet fraud. And from time to time, we see embezzlement and theft, inflated expense claims, personal expenses charged to an organization, unnecessary or luxury travel. And let me just say that we have seen in corporation programs all of these things, and people have gone to jail over some of them. So while I hope none of you ever confronts this, it does happen from time to time. You should be aware of it. And if you see an indication of it or something that makes you uncomfortable, don't stick your head in the sand. Okay? Often there are small rumblings, and people don't want to believe that something untoward is going on, and so they just don't want to think about it, and they put it aside. And that means that they missed an opportunity to get ahead of the problem while it was a small problem, and then it gradually grew into a crisis. Now, these are just examples. The human mind can be very creative when it comes to ways of committing fraud. Okay, so what do you do if you find evidence of fraud? Well, the first thing you do is contact OIG and do it early, okay? Don't try to do your own investigation and then get in touch with us. And there are a number of reasons for contacting OIG. First of all, we can tell you how to proceed, what documents you should gather, when to confront somebody you think has committed serious misconduct. We have capabilities, skills, and resources that most nonprofits don't. And one of the things we can do is help analyze the financial records and trace funds. That's not something that comes naturally to people who don't do it all the time. That's our bread and butter. We can do that. We can also recommend measures that strengthen your internal controls to prevent a recurrence, or at least give you an early warning. So reporting this kind of misconduct protects the integrity of federal programs. We all have an interest in making sure that the taxpayer funds are spent as they should be. Reporting early stops the bleeding, okay? It allows your organization to recover from the misconduct. And if we don't get a report, we have to think that an organization is condoning the misconduct and might properly be regarded as complicit. Or as we'd like to say a little bit cavalierly, if you condone it, you own it. So what exactly should you report? Well, here are kind of the typical patterns of misconduct that can happen in dealing with federal grant funds. Fraud, theft, or embezzlement. Okay, intentional misuse of government funds or property. You could see that occasionally you get word that there's somebody who's sort of running their own private business with computers paid for by the federal government, more than incidental use, or someone profiting personally because they have access to grant funds. That obviously is impermissible. False or fraudulent claims or statements. If you falsify a term sheet, okay, that is a false claim, all right? If, for example, auditors are in your office and they ask you a question and they don't get a truthful response, that is a false statement and it is a serious problem. Interference with an audit is a serious problem. Forgery or falsification of records relating to grants is a serious problem. If you need to prepare documentation after the fact, and if you're careful, you shouldn't have to, but if you do, make it clear that this is a document that was prepared on this date and it's prepared as of a date in the past. So no one thinks that you are backdating a document to try to hoodwink someone into thinking about it. And one of the most serious, corruption, bribery, or kickbacks. We don't often see it, but it can happen with federal grant funds. Here, most important, reporting this information safeguards the integrity of a federal program. And the Office of Inspector General is the only organization within the corporation that has jurisdiction for criminal investigations. And even if the matter turns out not to be criminal, it turns out to be an administrative problem, we have the experience and the expertise to investigate these things and to draw distinctions between what is criminal and what may just be a mistake, or what might have just been sloppy, or what was careless, or what shows a weakness in your organization's procedures and internal controls, but isn't necessarily intentional misconduct. And those are the key things that you want to know in figuring out how you respond. Is this a one-off? Does it show a serious problem? We can tell you if you discover a problem in one area, does that suggest you ought to be looking in other areas as well? So we can help you make those judgments. So how do you report to the Office of Inspector General? Well, the easiest thing to do is you can pick up the phone and call my office. Our number is on the corporation website, and anybody can pick up the phone and call. We also have a hotline specifically for reporting. And by the way, although we say you must report fraud, you can also report. You can choose to report waste or mismanagement or other bad practices that you think really need to be corrected and aren't being properly addressed. And not just within your organization, but within the corporation. You may see something that you think is really unwise. You've talked to somebody about it. You're not getting a decent response. It is perfectly fine to pick up the phone and call us, okay? When you report information to us, it is confidential, okay? We do not, file a report that says Joan Smith from the state of Wisconsin in thus and such a grant program has told us that X is going on. We have those records internally. They are not available to anyone outside this office. And just to protect you, if you are really concerned, you can even report on an anonymous basis. We prefer that you don't, because sometimes you may call our hotline, and you can do that by the phone number here or by email and leave a message, okay? And it may be we read it and we need more information. We have questions. We need more detail in order to understand exactly what's happening. If you've reported to us anonymously, we don't have anybody to call back to get that information. So we ask you to leave your identity, but we understand in some cases people may not want to. But just so you understand, we are experts at protecting your identity if that is what you want from us. And you don't have to call just because you think there is, serious fraud going on. If you see something that doesn't sit well with you, that doesn't strike you as a good practice, you can give us a call. We've seen, a wide spectrum of conduct, and sometimes we can offer a perspective for you. We can validate you. We can tell you, no, that's really not a problem, which sometimes we do. We get a call about a practice from someone, and they describe it to us, and we say, well, actually, the rules permit that. So that's not something you need to lose any sleep over. So it goes both ways. We're happy to share our experiences with you and to put things in context for you. I want to acquaint you with another piece of this in connection with reporting. And this is, many of you will have this rule in your states. There is now a federal rule that deals with whistleblowers at grantees, okay? By law, you as somebody who is affiliated with a federal grantee cannot be retaliated against for reporting waste, fraud, and abuse to OIG. Okay, as long as you're acting in good faith, even if you're wrong, okay? Even if you're wrong, you cannot be retaliated against by a supervisor or by anybody else for reporting waste, fraud, or abuse to OIG. And by the same token, you can't retaliate against anyone in your organization who reports something to OIG in good faith. Now, if they do it in bad faith, knowing it's not true, just to cause trouble, that's a different story. But we want to create a safe channel for people to share their concerns, and reporting to OIG is such a safe channel. If you think you've been retaliated against, you should bring that to our attention. That is something we can do something about. We have a whistleblower ombudsman as part of our staff to help direct you. We can do an investigation to see whether someone has been retaliated against. That's really the conclusion of my formal presentation. It's really a pleasure to talk to you and to have an opportunity to share our thoughts and our experiences with so many people who are out in the field confronting these issues and, most importantly, trying to avoid finding themselves in any of these problems. As I said at the outset, OIG tends to have a sort of jaundiced view because we see when things go wrong. So we want to make that information available to all the folks out there in the field so they can be sensitive to those issues and be sure to get things right. This is part of our most important mission, in my view, which is preventing problems. So if you are well informed about places that other people have gotten into trouble, you can avoid those same pitfalls. I can't take questions today in our live session, but as Amy said at the outset, you can email questions to us about this presentation at questions@cncsoig.gov. That is separate from the hotline, so please use it just if you have a question about something that we've said in this presentation. We will post the answers later on so that everyone can share them and learn from one another. And I really want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I got into this line of business, as Amy indicated at the outset, from the private practice of law, where I represented people who were accused of fraud, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. And I think it's very, very important that any audits and investigations that take place be thorough, be rigorous, be impartial, not be looking to score points, but really trying to understand what happened, and most of all, that the conclusions leave the organization better off, that we can offer some practical solutions that will make it easier for you to do your job and for the corporation to do its job. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Deb, for your time today. This really is a unique opportunity to hear directly from our Inspector General, and in particular to unveil the common accountability problems they experience in their audits. This session aligns perfectly with the corporation's state office compliance monitoring efforts to help senior corp program sponsors and staff design efficient and effective internal controls and to follow them accordingly to avoid these common problems. We hope that this session was useful to you and ask that you complete the post-session assessment at your earliest convenience. And this session will be available on demand shortly. Thank you again to Ms. Jeffrey for your thorough review of how and what the Office of Inspector General does, and particularly for your insightful recommendations for senior core program sponsors and staff to maintain and improve accountability. Again, if you have questions, please submit them to questions@cncsoig.gov. Thank you for joining us for this session.